Hey everyone. So today I'm going to start what will be a few weeks long exploration of Deleuze and Guattari's 1,000 Plateaus. So a few things to say. This episode is going to cover chapters 1, 2, and 3. So those are the introduction, Rhizome, one or several wolves, and then the Geology of Morals is the third chapter. Now I'm going to be going through 3 or 4 chapters plateaus every single week. But I want you to know that I've already done chapters 11 and 13, that is, of the refrain and apparatuses of capture, on their own. So that doesn't affect anything with this episode, but for the future, I won't be talking about them again because I've done individual episodes on them where I had much smarter people come and tell me about this stuff. So you can go and find those if you'd like right now, and then additionally, you can follow me on Instagram if you want to, at theory_and_philosophy. You can contribute to me by, simply liking, sharing, subscribing, leaving comments, telling your friends, tell your friends that this is a great way to fall asleep, and you can play my maybe soothing voice to help you fall asleep in the blanket darkness of the night. If you want, you can contribute monetarily. That would obviously be great via Patreon or PayPal. And I don't want to waste any more of your time, so let's just jump into this, starting with the first plateau, introduction, Rhizome. So they begin by commenting on their multiplicitous selves. And that's going to be a theme that really runs throughout the course of this book, that is opposing multiplicities to unities or totalities, where they don't really like unities or totalities because they're way too restrictive. And the big ones they kind of take aim at are, the biggest one is psychoanalysis. Now, for those that haven't read Anti-Oedipus, I've covered it in its entirety on here, so you can check that out if you'd like. But obviously reading it would be better. They really don't like psychoanalysis because it reduces everything to the Oedipal complex or Oedipus. So they want to try and explode that category into multiplicities. And they really try to emulate that with their style. And I had one of my friends that came on to talk about Of the Refrain had mentioned that Deleuze and Guattari, how they would write this is one of them would write a few lines and another one would write a few other lines. And reading it, you kind of get that sense is that it does feel kind of jarring at times, at least the how the writing goes and how the arguments unfold, because they repeat things that maybe they shouldn't have repeated, and they talk about things that maybe they should have given more kind of context to. But in any case, you're left with this kind of compendium of different ideas about the world, essentially. And this book, it's massive. It's like almost 500 pages, I think, really covers a lot. From the earliest states of civilizations all the way to today and beyond. And I think that was their effort to try and realize these multiplicities, that is to recognize how all these things don't form a cohesive whole, even though one could say that is the case with this book, the fact that it all comes together in this book, but instead that there are all of these things going on that can't necessarily be subsumed under a kind of guiding principle or totality. And I should also say, even those people that analyze books come to see books, as I've already alluded to, as this kind of totality, where they view, even the spine of the book as being like the kind of grounding, and then the pages that come out of it, the leaves of the taproot of the tree, of what they'll call a kind of arborescent framework, an arborescent structure that is a totality that they aren't very fond of. And this is because this arborescent structure is comprised of roots and radicals, which are fundamentally different from, and here's the title, from rhizomes, the title of the chapter. Now, I've seen some explanations that use the image of roots to illustrate the rhizome, which is wrong. And part of me thinks that even in episodes I've done, I might have said that. Well, it's not entirely wrong, but it needs to be qualified. But they contrast these roots and radicals, and not radical as in like a political radical, but radicals as in the kind of dealing with plants and roots and whatnot. They contrast that with bulbs and tubers that they say to be rhizomatic. And what they mean by that is that they don't have a mapped trajectory. That is, they seem to go in any which direction they please. They don't have a really beginning nor an end. They don't necessarily just follow the mechanistic formula of cause and effect. There really seems to be no proper way to understand them. And they will come to use this to kind of illustrate the rhizome in relation to Brownian motion, that is Brownian physics, and quantum physics not being, capturable by a mechanistic understanding of the world. Now, because these bulbs and tubers, what they equate with the rhizome, doesn't really have a map, or it isn't really mapped out per se, and it doesn't really have a single identity, but is rather comprised of multiplicities, if you engage with a rhizome in the true sense, then that means you are not really engaging with a single thing. You are engaging with multiplicities of things. And with that, we see the end of the subject-object split in a pretty neat way. And this presents a kind of radical egalitarianism, where everything is recognized as being just a part of everything else, or having the potential to be connected to everything else. And they form this kind of their kind of multiplicitous nature upon what is called the plane of consistency, where differences are kind of effaced in favor of a limitless potential. Now, this obviously has connections to their idea of the body without organs. That is, the body without organs is the kind of plane upon which certain things can inscribe themselves to give them an identity, and in doing so gives the body without organs its shape. But that will then becomes what they will come to call a kind of stratified zone that corresponds to only that specific kind of moment, which can then be kind of shot out into various new moments, various new strata, and so on. So one way I like to demonstrate this is with a field, like a grassy field. And let's say there are a few kids who happen to find a ball. Now, all of these things taken on their own, we have this open field, we have these kids, and we have like a ball, don't really constitute anything. But suddenly if the kids, like a couple of them, take off their shoes and make kind of makeshift kind of goalposts out of these shoes, at least markers for kinds of goalposts, then suddenly we have something here. We have essentially a soccer field. And let us say that field, before it was, given this kind of identity, was the body without organs. Now, the organs are the shoes that make up the goalposts, the kids that will be playing, and the ball that is, part of that structure. So what we then see upon this plane of consistency is the formation of this game, soccer, upon which these organs attain their identities, because now the kids are no longer kids, they're soccer players. The shoes are no longer shoes, they're, these goalposts. The ball is no longer a ball, it's a soccer ball. So there is a kind of mutual engagement here. Now, that is always apt to change and, transform into something else and mutate into a different kind of framework. But in that moment, it is ostensibly agreed upon that there is a kind of multiplicitous action, because the kind of connections that are made between the kid or one of the kids and their foot machine connects with the ball machine, which is ostensibly meant to go into the goal machine, doesn't have a kind of hierarchical principle. That is, it hasn't been inscribed with a power to determine, various zones of appreciation over others. Now, this can be illustrated a number of other ways. You can think of a cornfield before the corn, which is or seeds are planted, which are intensities or intensities to come are placed in the ground, which then give then make that field into a cornfield, but was initially a body without organs, and how these organs, these seeds, make it so, and in so doing, give the corn its own potential. Anyways, so all this to try and illustrate what this plane of consistency is and what this kind of body without organs looks like. Now, to go back again to my soccer example, if at any given moment, those kids, the soccer ball, the goalposts, they assume a kind of identity. But this identity can obviously be taken away. And if we really look at it, the kid is not just a kid. It's like, a foot machine connected to a leg machine, connected to a body machine. And for more on this whole discussion of machines, Anti-Oedipus is really the place to go for that. But just think of it as, not looking at things in terms of totalities, but as being comprised of several different parts. So, the shoe machine that makes up the goalpost machine is really like a shoelace machine with a sole machine with a, I don't know, the sides of a shoe, whatever those are called, with the sides of a shoe machine all being connected together. And with that, we see the coming together of all these machines in a kind of territorial way, which can then be uprooted and deterritorialized once again. So I realize I'm introducing new kind of ideas in here, and let me take a second to explain that. So before the soccer field was constituted, we had a deterritorialized kind of plane. That is, there was nothing inscribed upon it. There was no identity given to this field. But then when the soccer game is constructed on this field, where the game of soccer is, then we have a kind of territorialization. But this territorialization is never ever fully territorialized because, negotiation happens. For example, the game might end, and then suddenly there's the uprooting of all those things. The kids have to put their shoe machines back on, the soccer ball ceases to be a soccer ball, and then, I don't know, they go and play with it as kickball or as a dodgeball or something, whatever, which is then the deterritorialization of something then being re-territorialized in another form. So they don't say that the rhizome is something that is completely deterritorialized. Rather, it is something that territorializes and deterritorializes, then re-territorializes, then deterritorializes over and over and over again. Now they throw a lot at us throughout this whole book, and so I'm trying to sift through and really cover what's important. But they call this a kind of mapping. That is, they situate alongside the rhizome the act of mapping, whereas they situate alongside a kind of restricted totalizing framework the idea of tracing, which is almost just like a copying of something, whereas mapping implies a kind of territorialization of something, that demanded some kind of imaginative capacity, perhaps, whereas tracing is just putting the paper on something else and just copying it verbatim. Now, if you're listening to all this and you're getting the sense that, Deleuze and Guattari, they just sound like materialists. That is, they're just concerned with things in the world and how multiplicitous those things are, and the inscription of a totality upon those things is, kind of almost a transcendent judgment. The fact that a human is considered this totality, or that we have something like Oedipus that explains all of our psychological, malaise, that is just, of no interest to them. They just look at the world and they're like, look how crazy this is. There's so much going on. How can I possibly understand this via some kind of totalizing framework, some totalizing schematic? And that's why they say, toward the end of the chapter, that rhizomes are immanent, whereas what they oppose to that, these totalizing frameworks, are transcendent. That is because they move out of this realm of the material into the, the metaphysical, or into the imaginative, in a way that tries to level, tries to smooth out all kind of differences, all kind of different, properties in favor of one a priori totalizing framework. And rhizomes, in their kind of materiality, play out on various levels. They engage in ways that they are unaware even to themselves. And so because of that, at least that's how they frame this book, as being comprised of these plateaus that their kind of rhizomatic thought flows through, as being these moments in which there's almost a possible possible reflection, but then quickly they move into something else, evading capture, evading kind of grounding of that idea. And that propels us now into chapter 2, 1914, One or Several Wolves. So from this chapter on, until the conclusion, every single plateau or chapter has a year that precedes the name of the chapter. And the year is significant because it means something in relation to what they're discussing. In this case, they're going to talk about the work done by Sigmund Freud on a Russian man. I believe his name is, I don't know how to pronounce this, Pankejeff? That's definitely not it. I'm going to say Pankejeff, who I believe was Russian, who had these dreams about wolves. And Freud read in these dreams about wolves, all the possible explanations that point to Oedipus, that point to Pankejeff's mother and father as being the reason that this guy is thinking about wolves or dreaming about wolves. So Freud looks at the wolves and he sees only daddy and mommy, at least the wolves as they're being told to him by Pankejeff. Sees only daddy and mommy. So Deleuze and Guattari are like, Freud is missing, the forest for the trees, essentially. Freud is looking, or no, that doesn't make sense. Forget that. Freud is missing the fact that there's he's missing the trees for the forest, is what I should say. That is, Freud is only seeing daddy and mommy when Pankejeff is talking about wolves, that he forgets that wolves are these pack animals that move in these packs that don't follow a kind of set framework, a kind of set possible analysis. And so because of that, they are open to a kind of possibility, and that possibility demands what he calls what they call in Anti-Oedipus a kind of schizoanalysis to oppose to psychoanalysis, because a schizoanalysis is going to look at the multiplicitous nature of the testimony by the patient and make sense of that, not in order to affirm the psychoanalyst's position. So the psychoanalyst hears what the patient says and then says, oh, that's because of Oedipus, thank God I'm here. Whereas the schizoanalyst says, you need to figure this out yourself, but I'm going to demonstrate to you that there is this multiplicity, and you can't reduce this to just a few moments in your life or something that greatly restrict what's happening, or one idea that is Oedipus. So they kind of make a quip at Freud, and they say well, if there had been 3 wolves, Freud would have probably said said that the patient's parents had sex 3 times. But if there was 5 wolves, maybe Freud would have said that the parents of the patient had sex at 5 o'clock or something, and the kid heard about it or heard it. Or maybe there was 6 wolves, and that was 6 was the hour that the kid went to sleep or something. I don't know, but whatever. But there was always an answer. Psychoanalysis, at least for Deleuze and Guattari, always has an answer, and they're suspicious of that because the answer is always Oedipus. So Freud, like I said, for Deleuze and Guattari, do not understand multiplicities. But on top of that, they do not understand the body without organs. So the body without organs, despite the name, isn't opposed to organs. Actually, what it is opposed to is organization of organs, really. So in the case of the soccer field that I mentioned, the body without organs actually welcomes play upon it. But if suddenly there was a kind of despot that came in and said, you must play soccer here forever, then the body without organs would not like that. In fact, it would have negative ramifications. Playing on the grass in that way would kill the grass, if it had to happen all the time. And we'd see the body without organs kind of begin to perish under the weight of that kind of despotic command. So to oppose Freud's explanation of the wolf man, or the images of wolves, they say, with their kind of schizoanalysis, this might be an example of Pankejeff not thinking about his parents subconsciously or unconsciously, but instead dreaming of this becoming wolf. The wolf that is a pack creature, that doesn't follow the kind of crowd, that doesn't give over not the crowd per se, but doesn't give over to this, despotic organization. So it's like a becoming wolf, which marks a kind of becoming intensity of the person that removes them from their subject position into something new, into something that is, beyond them, right? And that marks a line of flight, which is another pretty important term. It marks a connection between, the human machine and the wolf machine. It marks a deterritorialization and then a reterritorialization into the wolf machine. But then the wolf, needs to bathe itself by flowing in the river, then becomes a fish machine in the process. And we see an endless cycle occurring here. So in this case, the pack of wolves doesn't have a history. It's becoming a fish. You can hardly trace that back to the wolf, which then can be traced back to the human. It doesn't have a history in the way that a mass does, the masses, the way that the, Oedipalized person does, where everything can be reduced to a single point. There's no beginning nor an end for this process of becoming, for this process of deterritorialization and reterritorialization. But this isn't to say that there's no hierarchy between the two, like you have masses on one side and packs on the other. You can have hierarchies in absolutely deterritorialized packs. Another example would be like, if you ever look up in the sky and you see, I don't know what species of bird it is, but a kind of bird, how they always travel in the pointed arrow. And there's one kind of guiding bird, and they keep changing this position. So we see a kind of establishment of a hierarchy, but then it's only liminal. It only lasts a few moments, really, or it's ephemeral or whatever. It doesn't last very long, and there's always a rotation. So we see this hierarchization always troubled and then established and then troubled and then established. Whereas with the masses, then you get fascism, then you get totalitarianism, then you get corporate control. You get all of these things that reduce the masses to a homogeneous whole, which makes it that much easier for something like psychoanalysis that really benefits off of these kind of totalizing narratives, because the whole has been homogenized and reduced to a mass. And they're like, I really want to stress. I want to stress that they aren't saying they want to oppose like their multiplicitous kind of schizoanalysis to the totalizing psychoanalysis. That's not what they want to do, because that would just be to inscribe a kind of another binary. Instead, they're giving us a framework that actually allows for things like Oedipus to exist, but just doesn't ascribe it the same status, the same totalizing status. And they're very clear about this in Anti-Oedipus. They're like, the psyche exists, the Oedipal framework, the Oedipal complex exists, but it's only one explanation among many. It's only one, kind of machine of the psyche in operation among myriad other machines. The problem that they have is when it assumes a kind of totalizing framework. And this is clear by the fact that they recognize perpetual territorializations and deterritorializations and reterritorializations and deterritorializations. So in that, they see various structures emerge, and they aren't denying that. They aren't saying everything. There's no like signifying structure to the whole system, but that these structures are ephemeral. They don't last. They're fleeting. And then that here moves us into the third chapter of Plateau, the last one I'll cover here, and a very difficult one, so I'm going to try and make it as clear as possible, assuming that I actually understood it. But it is titled 10,000 BC, The Geology of Morals. Who does the Earth think it is? So 10,000 BC, I believe they're just referring to probably one of the earliest state formations, that is with Jericho, probably ancient Jericho. They could be making reference to Catalhoic, which came a few years later, but Jericho was also called Tel El Sutton, I think. Anyways, these different early state formations in which we are seeing the crystallization of the state and of civilization as we know it today, which they come to talk about a lot later as well in Apparatus of Capture, which you can actually go listen to now. because I've already covered it, including of the refrain. Reminder, reminder. So this chapter is a play on, or a kind of reading of, Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote Sherlock Holmes, his story, The Lost World, in which they're recounting a character named Professor Challenger giving this kind of diatribe about stratification and about the formation of kind of cultural singularities in the form of identities, in the form of these structures that humans kind of construct. And Deleuze and Guattari are kind of correlating that to the idea of stratification in terms of geology. So that's like how there are layers of rocks upon layers of rocks, how that can be used to understand ideas about singular, constructed, concretized identities and their relationship to other concrete identities. So if you have, two things, if I have my water bottle in one hand and my book in the other, and I put them on top of one another, I have stratified or created some kind of a stratification between the two, and they aren't like meeting, but they're coming like infinitely close. So we have like a layering effect here. Now think of this in terms of people, where you come in relation between two individuals. You can come infinitely close to someone, but for some reason you never actually get there. And they don't really talk about it in these terms. I'm just trying to illustrate it. And between you is kind of like an impassable barrier, this stratified kind of limit that you can't breach to get into the other person, like, I guess almost metaphysically. You can't get into their soul. And so there's always going to be that limit. So how do you negotiate these kinds of barriers? Now, I also want to say as a kind of preface that they talk a lot in this chapter about various scientific theories, about like everything. I'm not going to touch on every single one just because I find that it's just going to make it more confusing. But I really want to emphasize, to get the full grasp of this chapter, this plateau, you should go and read it. But I'm going to do my best to make it make some kind of sense. So they start out by saying that the world is a body without organs. The world is a kind of open field upon which, identities can be inscribed. And it is in those acting identities that form various layerings upon the earth. And we can also think about this in terms of like, the various tectonic plates underneath the earth's surface that make up the earth and give it its kind of its identity. But another way we can think about this is like how we carve out certain parts of the earth for our own needs. Like we cut out like fields for farming, and next to the field of farming is like your house, or the plot of land for your house or something, or your kind of communal setting. And so there's all these kind of barriers established, these kind of stratifications, these kinds of layering, this kind of horizontal layering occurring on the surface of the earth that gives the earth a kind of identity. But it's always trying to it's always trying to get rid of these stratifications because, let's face it, it's a body without organs. It wants to embrace kind of endless potential, and the only way it can do that is by tearing things down and building them up anew again. So I didn't mention this with the last chapter, but like every single chapter title is accompanied with a photo. And the last one had like a picture of wolf's paw prints, going through the snow, I think, or going through some kind of ground, whatever. And this one is a picture of a lobster. Now, a lobster obviously has two pincers. And the idea here is that in a stratification, when you have a stratum, what you have for them is what they will come to call, and we aren't there yet, so if you happen to know a lot about this chapter, don't yell at me because I know we're not there yet, but they come to call this a double articulation. So in a stratum, they say the stratum is facing both toward itself and facing to the body without organs, almost like it recognizes that it shouldn't even be there and that it should almost anticipate its own demise. So when it looks to itself in its desire to maintain itself, it is the interstratum. Whereas when it looks to the body without organs, it is the metastratum, right? It's looking at that stratum, or at least itself as a stratum. Instead of just trying to maintain itself, it's suddenly contemplating its own stratumness. And because this stratification has this kind of doubling effect, they use the example of the double pincers on the lobster. Like it's producing these kind of two characters, these two qualities. So that leads them to say that the strata that are often imposed upon the earth as though they are infallible, like as though they're going to last forever, must have been bestowed by some kind of god. So then, therefore, God must be a lobster. And I think that's what they mean when they say God is a lobster, because it is, these strata have these double faces, these kind of double identities that would have only been produced by double pincers, so it must have been a lobster, which would make God a lobster. So one half of this pair that comprises the stratum chooses or deducts from unstable particle flows metastable molecular or quasi-molecular units upon which it imposes a statistical order, while the other half of the pair establishes functional, compact, stable structures and constructs the molar compounds in which these structures are actualized. So we're seeing, and this goes back to what we talked about in the last chapter, where you see this kind of simultaneous deterritorialization and reterritorialization. So we see that occurring again with these strata, where they are unto themselves as being structures that have their own kind of agendas. And then they are in recognition of the, indeterminacy provided by the body without organs, or itself as being only a machine among other machines, and being in then coordination with various other flows, intensities, machines that it must navigate. So both of these are comprised of a form and a substance. So you can have the form of the first pair, the form of its being unto like itself, versus the form of it being unto a kind of microparticle, microphysical intensifications, and then it can have the substance of each. So in both, they add the fact that because both have form and both have substance, they say that form is essentially the determination of a coding or decoding, while a substance is a formed matter and its degree of territorialization or deterritorialization. So let me say that again. Form is a kind of determination of a coding or decoding, while a substance is a formed matter and its degree of territorialization or deterritorialization. And those are my words, not theirs. So how can we make sense of that? Form is in the way that a thing is determined, that is how it is coded or decoded, according to a kind of determining gaze. One that is able to say, let's say the plot of land again that's worked out as being like a farmer's field or something, to grow crops on or something. It is determined, coded in that way, which then gives it that identity. Even before there are crops, like it has to be determined in that way. Whereas its substance is like what actually within that gives it a certain justification of having that. So they then, and this is presented so weirdly because they're like, Professor Challenger, that person that this chapter is kind of talking about from Arthur Conan Doyle, is saying all this wacky stuff in this story, and they're just essentially recounting it as though Deleuze and Guattari are among the audience of this Professor Challenger giving this lecture, among all these other kind of scientists and anthropologists and linguists and stuff. And so they're like, okay, well, how do we make sense of all of this then? Because if both of the pairs can have a form and a substance, how do we differentiate then form and substance? Because they go so far as to say that, well, it seems like form and substance aren't really all that much differentiated if they can be so equally applied across these different structures. So instead, they borrowing from, and this is another pronunciation I'm going to screw up, I believe it's Hjemslöv, Helmslov, which would be a Nordic name, I assume, but Danish or Danish probably, or Norwegian, they, borrowing from him, begin to think of it rather not in a distinction between form and substance, but rather a distinction between content and expression, where they say that content and expression are opposed, and content and expression can better fit into this double pair, this double articulation between one side of the stratum and the other, of which you can have both a form and a substance of content and a form and a substance of expression. So, for example, if you have let's say you had this stupid cornfield again, you have the form of the corn, which is also the content, also the substance, I should say. So let me back that up a little bit. You have the corn in the field, that's the content, which can have a form, which is how it presents itself, and the substance is the actual physical matter. And then you have the demarcation of the field itself, a kind of aesthetic quality that signifies more than just aesthetics, like it denotes the field. That can have a form, because like what kind of fence are you using, or how is it meant to convey to people that it does that task? How is it meant to do that? And it has a substance in like what the tangible fence is actually like. How is it going to keep out, rabbits or something from eating the corn, if rabbits eat corn? I don't know. And we're going to return to this idea of content and expression in a little bit. And I know this is probably very dense, and I hope I'm explaining it okay, but anyways, you can go back and listen to it again if you want. So they go back to talking more about strata and what strata necessarily mean. So between strata isn't necessarily like an empty space, even though two strata coming infinitely close together don't really ever fully touch. Like there's always going to be implied some kind of empty space, because there's like, if you look at a wall, like a rock wall that has various layers, the fact that we can even see layers implies that there's some kind of space, some kind of differentiation between the two. They haven't fully kind of synthesized into one. And like because of the plane of consistency, no stratum is greater than another. They concede there are substrata to a substratum or to a stratum, but these substrata are themselves strata, or stratums. Each substrata is itself a stratum, which then has its own substrata, ad infinitum. There's no end to this process. There's no end stratum. There's no end genus to species or something. And so you have, again, this kind of tension between the stratum embracing itself as what they call the ecumenon versus its recognition upon the plane of consistency, which will imply its own undoing as a stratum. Because as soon as it recognizes that, it must recognize that it is not this kind of totally singular entity. Rather, it is among other things, and it disappears into a sea of multiplicities and a sea of possible becomings. So they oppose then the ecumenon, which is the recognition of the stratum itself, versus the planomenon, which is the recognition of, or which is the plane of consistency, essentially. So between strata, you have various negotiations about where identity exists, and you find identity constituted not by the middle of a stratum. Like if you take a single stratum, its identity is not where the middle is, but rather where the borders are, because that identifies the kind of limits of the stratum, and it is in those limits that you actually recognize the stratum itself. Like in the case of that cornfield, you do not recognize the cornfield by the cornfield, but by its being demarcated as such. So its identity does not come from within itself. It comes from its relation to others, a kind of, Jacques Derrida talks about it like a différence, right? It attains its identity in relation to others, that there's a constant process of deferral. Now, they don't talk about it really in those terms, but you recognize that, or we recognize here, that the borders of the stratum give it its identity. It doesn't come from within. So all strata, despite their differences, their multiplicities, all find their place on the plane of consistency, the kind of body without organs. And so they share that kind of commonality. And so because of that, they have a kind of common tool that brings them into being, because they all come from the same place. And that tool assumes one of two kind of forms. Assumes either the abstract machine or the machinic assemblage. Yeah, assemblage. I don't know why I got confused about that for a second. So I just want to read a little part about that. This is on 71 in my version. Chances are it's this kind of Brian Masumi translated version that everyone has, if you have the book. They say that the abstract machine sometimes develops upon the plane of consistency, whose continuums, emissions, and conjugations it constructs, and sometimes remains enveloped in a stratum whose unity of composition and force of attraction or prehension it defines. The machinic assemblage is something entirely different from the abstract machine, even though it is very closely connected with it. First, on a stratum, it performs the coadaptations of content and expression, ensures bi-univocal relationships between segments of content and segments of expression, and guides the division of the stratum into epistrata and peristrata, so into its center, into its peripheries. Next, between strata, it ensures, we're still on machinic assemblages, it ensures the relation to whatever serves as a substratum and brings forth the corresponding changes in organization. Finally, it is in touch with the plane of consistency because it necessarily effectuates the abstract machine on a particular stratum between strata in relation between the strata and the plane. So we have the abstract machine that brings the stratum into effect. And it can then kind of, by virtue of that, move across various strata. And it can sometimes find its place on one of them and exist there very comfortably. Whereas the machinic assemblage is what allows a kind of negotiation between the recognition of the possibility of recognition across various strata and can allow the movement of that abstract machine. So they are necessary for each other, because it allows the machinic assemblage is what gives a kind of potential to the abstract machine in its constituting and its ability to move across these various strata. So what can they look like if we, transpose this idea of strata from geology onto like human populations? Well, they say that it could look physicochemical, organic, or anthropomorphic, which they also call alloplastic. So the first concerns essentially all matter, roughly. The second is dealing with living things, humans, animals, anything like that. And the third is concerned with humans' creations, like technology and language, tools, and symbols. Really what they focus on is language, but it's important to keep in mind all of the other imaginative products, or the products of the human mind, essentially, that allow the human to extend themselves in space in a way that isn't afforded to other animals that don't use like tools, for example, because language is really just a tool. And I've read a bunch of things, and in my mind, many people really focus on language here when it should also include everything else. So with this last stratum and the possibility for creation, imaginative creation, what we have then is a certain possibility, a deterritorial possibility afforded to humans that were previously foreclosed. And now they return to this idea of content and expression, because it is in this phase, in this stratum, that we see the kind of replacement of form and substance with content and expression. We see it be the most clear. So they say that what is pretty clear are the new distributions between content and expression. Technological content characterized by the hand-tool relation, and at a deeper level tied to a social machine and formations of power. And then we have a symbolic expression characterized by face language relations, and at a deeper level tied to a semiotic machine and regimes of signs. So content here refers to the social machine and formations of power, which they contrast with symbolic expression that is characterized by face-language relations and a semiotic machine and regimes of signs. So the reason that form and substance for them is unsatisfactory is because each of these things, that is this regime of signs or this kind of social force, these social machines, can each have their own form and substance. You can have the form of a regime of signs, of these kind of linguistic signifiers, but you also have the substance. And they're going to get into this more in the next chapter when they talk about like speech act. That is how speech has a content that is beyond what it proclaims to say, but in the act of speaking does something, like it does have an effect that extends beyond its form. They'll talk about that more there. So this is how they draw this new distinction that, has kind of been given birth by humanity by these new, the new possibilities afforded by language. And the time is very appropriate because they're talking about this in 10,000 BC when humans were first starting to kind of galvanize their own human identity as sedentary, state-building creatures. So they don't want to say that language is necessarily foreclosed to these other strata, but they want to say that there's something kind of new about this strata, in that there's the introduction of like signification, which allow the emergence of signs, at least how signs can manifest themselves in either indexes, symbols, or icons. And this is taking out of like the linguistic theory, I guess, of like Peirce, or I guess that would be it, where you have an index, which is a territorial sign, which is just like, but just Google it. But if you're not on the internet, whatever. An index is like, I like to think of it like a street sign that's like slippery when wet, or almost, or it's like a sign that doesn't have an actual attachment to the thing it's representing, but that we culturally agree to be good. Actually, the internet just tells me it's like skull and crossbones, which we know to mean death, even though that's not what death looks like. Whereas we have a symbol. A symbol is esoteric. So like you can have a symbol for like a cult or a clan or something that not anyone would understand. Like you need to be taught about what it necessarily means. And then you have icons, which are direct representations of the thing. Like the most vulgar example is like, cisgender bathrooms, right? You have the person wearing the dress is supposed to be a woman, and the person not wearing a dress via those stupid symbols, not wearing a dress is supposed to be a man. So we see this emergence kind of happen. And it's not like they have a problem with this. They aren't saying like, necessarily all this language is like, is oppressive in itself. What they're getting at is how reductive it comes to be when we think of the world in terms of signification, or in terms of signifiers and signified. So this is coming out of right out of semiotic theory. So for those that don't know, if I have a table, I use the word table, table, as a signifier for this actual thing that you hear me tapping on right now, the thing in the world. Or I could draw it, and that's a signifier for this thing I'm tapping on, this table, this desk, I should say. So in this, they see an attempt to make a kind of one-to-one ratio between the signifier and the signified, which they correctly identify, the signified is always subordinated to the signifier, because the signified can't talk for itself. The signified can't represent itself. It needs the signifier to represent the signified. So they give an example borrowing from Foucault, where Foucault talks about the prison. And we take the prison and imagine the thing in the world, the signified, what a prison looks like. But as Foucault correctly identifies, suddenly there was a point in history, and he does the whole genealogy of this, does the whole history of the prison, where a number of different signifiers, like delinquency, punishment, surveillance, could all be associated with the prison. So the attempt to kind of bring everything under the kind of linguistic, imperialist linguistic association between signifiers and signifieds is just incredibly reductive, and they really get into this in the next chapter. So stay tuned for that when they talk about, they really go after Chomsky and other linguists who they find to be just reprehensible almost. So they, instead of looking at signifiers and signifieds, they want to look at signs, as I presented them earlier, that are all signs of territorialization and deterritorialization, where you have things like esotericism in the form of the symbol, where the symbol represents something that we can't just understand, where the index is like culturally contingent, and so there's like a negotiation there, stratification between different cultures that or mark out the stratification, a kind of territorialization of the sign for someone and a deterritorialization of it for someone else. And again, I just want to say, like, they're still recounting this speech, or I guess this talk with Challenger and a few other figures throughout this whole process, and Challenger's going more and more mad in the process. So they kind of conclude by saying that all strata, as a quick summary, are comprised of these two heads, content and expression, this double articulation, where the machinic assemblage connects strata and is therefore connected to the phenomenon, the plane of consistency, and it also sets the abstract machine into motion. And then here they conclude by saying Challenger has now kind of fully entered the rhizosphere. He's kind of completely lost touch with all like stratifications as he believed them to be in these kind of coordinated and simplified ways. Now it's like this explosion of meaning into the multiplicities. So yeah, that is about it, the first 3 chapters of 1,000 Plateaus. Now, next time I'm going to start from chapter 4, and that's that. Hope you enjoyed it. If I omitted anything or did anything wrong, please let me know. Yeah, catch you next time.